So over to you, Colleen, all the best.
Thanks very much, and apologies, Reggie, the dog decided to start barking just there a second ago. Firstly, thank you all for attending, and Fergus did mention that the reason for today's webinar is to launch the numeracy definition report that we commissioned recently, and Aoife has just put it in the chat, and as have I, so you'll have the opportunity to kind of download that later. But we're delighted that we have the researchers with us today. And I'll introduce them in a second, but just to give you a little bit of background to this report, in 2019, NALA had been commissioned by Solus to do a report on numeracy practice in ETBs, and we collaborated at that point with some similar researchers that are here to look at what was kind of happening in terms of numeracy provision within education and training boards. And one of the primary recommendations out of that report, which is also available on our website, was that there needed to be kind of a clear definition of what is numeracy. So that kind of encouraged us to do this piece of research, really to look at how people understood numeracy and maths and how it could inform literacy and numeracy provision going forward. So I won't kind of hold you any further. I'll now introduce kind of 3 of the kind of 5 researchers that we had engaged in the research. And the first is Dr. Niamh O'Meara, who is lecturer in maths education in the University of Limerick. We also have with us Dr. Fiona Faulkner, who is lecturer in maths in Technological University Dublin, and then Dr. Cathy O'Sullivan, who is lecturer in maths education in the University of Galway, recently rebranded. And we also the other participant researchers in this project were Dr. Mark Prendergast from the University College Cork, and Dr. Merlin Goose, all the way from Australia. Regrettably, they're not with us today, but we have Niamh, Cathy, and Fiona, who will be doing kind of a triple tag team act in presenting the research to you. So I'm going to turn over to Niamh now to kind of guide you through the main kind of the research itself and findings with 2 of her team. So Niamh.
Thanks a million, Colleen. No problem. So hopefully everyone can see that.
Yep.
Yep, brilliant. So thanks, Colleen. And again, I suppose we want to say, first and foremost, thanks to NALA for the opportunity to conduct this research. Each and every one of the team found it a really interesting project to be engaged in, and we really hope that the results will inform future policy and practice in numeracy provision in Ireland. So this report was a report on adult learners' understanding and conceptualization of numeracy and how that aligned with international definitions and frameworks around numeracy. So again, sorry for some reason. Oh, there we go. So just an overview of the presentation. Colleen has actually touched on the background, so I won't spend too long on that. Looking at the theoretical framework, Cathy's actually going to speak to us about that. We will then look at the research design and methodology, and Fiona, who kindly agreed to speak on that. And myself and Fiona will then discuss the findings, the main findings to come, and we will look at some of the implications to emerge from it. So, as Colleen has mentioned, Solus commissioned NALA to conduct a research study and that was the aim of it, to capture and document both standalone and integrated numeracy provision in Ireland. And that was the first task, I suppose, that Merlin was leading that project, but that was the first task that we were set. And then following from that, we were following the insights we got in relation to the activity that was happening in terms of standalone integrated numeracy. We were tasked then with devising a set of good practice guidelines. And as Colleen mentioned, the first of these guidelines suggested a pressing need to agree on a definition for numeracy. So just why did we need to do this, or what was it that kind of spurred us into action, I suppose, here? We have to acknowledge that the concept of numeracy has evolved greatly since it was first used in the Crowther report in 1959. So in 1959, Crowther coined numerate as a phrase that was a mirror image of the word literacy, while also including the skills necessary to think quantitatively. So the initial definition was quite vague, but it was used kind of up until around 1975, 1980s. But what happened with this initial definition, by stating that it was a mirror image of literacy, meant that numeracy began to be seen as, let's say, a subcategory of literacy, or a subset of literacy. And that connotation around numeracy has not gone away, and it still exists today, despite advancements in the definition of numeracy. So the next advancement was in the Cockcroft report, and he did offer a much broader definition when he ascertained the word numeracy to have two attributes. The first of these attributes was an at-homeness with numbers and an appreciation of mathematical representations. So really he was saying that it was more than number, but it wasn't specific enough still. It did begin to link numeracy to mathematics that we use every day, but it continued to focus on basic mathematical skills. And that is another issue that still surrounds the conceptualization of numeracy today, that it just requires basic understanding or basic skills. Numeracy then went on to be defined as mathematics when it's integrated in cultural, social, personal, and emotional scenarios. That was between 2000 up to the current day. But what we're seeing now is a shift towards a view of numeracy as a social practice. And that is probably where the road we're going down, so to speak. However, in this report, we, the authors, do acknowledge that there are different ideological perspectives on numeracy. And what we believe is key is striking a balance between viewing numeracy as this social practice. So that is a skill and an attribute that allows us to participate in everyday life, and viewing numeracy as a technical skill. So another reason for undertaking a study of this kind is the existence of numerous comparable terms for numeracy. So for example, mathematical literacy may be used, or quantitative literacy. Using mathematical literacy, again, has a very strong, or makes it very difficult to differentiate numeracy from mathematics, which we'll discuss a good bit more later on. And we also see in both of these expressions, the term literacy is still being used. So quantitative literacy would suggest more of a focus on the statistics side of numeracy. And as I said, mathematical literacy means we struggle to differentiate between the two concepts of mathematics and numeracy. Again, another reason for this study is the need to differentiate numeracy from school mathematics, because I think we all can acknowledge, albeit reluctantly, that there are negative connotations associated with school mathematics. A lot of people have had difficulties in school mathematics, and by continuing to associate numeracy with school mathematics, and particularly basic school mathematics, which many people feel they never got on top of, it means that we are helping or adding to the problem of recognizing numeracy as something very much confined to the mathematics classroom. And finally, and again, one of the more pressing reasons for this study is the new Adult Literacy for Life strategy published by Solis in 2021 does not actually offer a definition for numeracy. And without a definition for numeracy, it's very hard to develop a good understanding of what it means to be numerate. So the study aim then was to determine adult learners' understanding of numeracy so as to support the development of a working definition of numeracy in Ireland. Now, I have to say at this point, this report does not offer a new definition for numeracy, but rather we sought to see adult learners' understanding and to see how it aligns with, firstly, the different existing models or definition for numeracy, and also how current conceptualizations align with the needs of the Irish economy and of these adults that were central to this study. Once we unearth these perceptions and understandings, we will be in a much better position to offer a meaningful definition for numeracy in the Irish context. Before we go any further, however, we would love to know what your understanding, what your conceptualizations of numeracy are, and we can then maybe do a comparison later on with the adults that we surveyed. So could we take maybe 2 or 3 minutes now? And if you want to go to that www.menti.com, and just enter the code 54873970. And all you do at that point is type in as many words or phrases that you associate with numeracy, and we'll try to create a word cloud from this. So I won't stop sharing the screen just in case anyone needs the code, but if everyone could just go to that menti.com and enter that code and put in as many phrases or words that you associate with numeracy.
They're all thinking hard, Niamh.
Put in anything at all. Let me see. So there's definitely terms coming in now. And hopefully people can see that. Maybe when people see others, they might spark something in themselves as well. I'm trying to count different examples here, and every time I do, it keeps moving. So we'll do a debrief at the end, maybe.
Niamh, my attempt to put fun into the mix of it is getting smaller and smaller.
It's vanishing very quickly.
Yeah, very quickly.
Okay, I'm just conscious of time, and I think there's some really nice ideas. What is interesting to me here is the bigger the number, as Colleen was suggesting, the fun was getting smaller, although some other people must have put it in there because it's got a tiny bit bigger. But the bigger the word, the more people that have said it. So clearly we can see the biggest word there is maths, but shortly or closely followed by money. Numbers is also mentioned. What I've just noticed is you have to have the exact same word, obviously, for it to become bigger. But if we look at some of the other words, applying numbers, using numbers, we can see number fluency is there. So we can see it's coming up more and more, this idea of numbers. Another thing that's coming out quite clearly is the financial literacy, or money, dealing with money. So understanding bills is there. So I'm trying to read these as they keep hopping around. We also have working out bills, dealing with bills. Someone mentioned financial literacy. But what is interesting, understanding and problem solving also seem to come to the fore when we talk about what numeracy means to us. So what I might do actually is just take a quick screenshot of that. So, and I can share it with you. I've often used word clouds like that to create posters. So you can have a look at that in more detail, maybe later on if you so wish. So let me just go back to the presentation. So the reason we wanted to get your idea of what numeracy was so that you could see how yours, first of all, I suppose, compares with the adult learners in this study, but also how it compares with the framework that underpinned this study, which Kathy is now going to speak to us about. So Kathy, I'll keep sharing my screen if you want to jump in.
Yeah, perfect. So as Niamh said, the theoretical framework there that underpinned this research was the Common European Numeracy Framework. And this is a framework that was developed as part of an Erasmus European project that myself and Niamh were working on with another 3 European countries. So I suppose the aim is to see what, as we know, Niamh has already mentioned that there are many definitions for numeracy, and that I suppose one sentence wouldn't be enough to capture the multi-dimensions of numeracy. So this framework we thought aligned very well with our research. So if you want to go to the next slide there, Niamh. So the very first one there that we're looking at is knowledge and skills. So I suppose this is kind of looking at number, dimension, your mathematical skills, being able to use a calculator, being able to convert fractions to decimals and percentages. And I suppose it should also be noted that none of these dimensions are actually like come first, or that there's a hierarchy of needs here, that the model basically can be entered at any point, that quantity and number doesn't come before, let's say, patterns or anything like that. So the next dimension in the theoretical framework then that we looked at was context. So I saw there in the cloud, there was everyday life was mentioned. So using, I suppose, numbers or mathematics in everyday life is very important. Being able to calculate a bill, sales prices, and splitting bills for a meal, and Niamh and Fiona are going to talk about that later on in the presentation, when we looked at some of the tutors and adult learners talking about splitting the bill and maybe calculating the tip or calculating the percentage of something. If there's 20% off in the supermarket, what does that actually mean? Determining, and this all links back to, I suppose, proportion and reasoning, and percentages that we use in everyday life, which obviously links to the previous domain for knowledge and skills. So the third dimension then was cognitive skills. So this is looking at the higher order skills. So managing situations and being able to analyze certain situations that we may find ourselves in as citizens, as employees, as employers. So looking at maybe advertisements that are thrown at us in everyday life, be it on the radio or on the television, in the newspapers, and making sense of those advertisements. Estimating if an object will fit in a certain space. If we're looking at scaling down a recipe, maybe a recipe for 6 people and you want to cook it for just 4 people, being able to reason and problem solve. And again, you mentioned problem solving in that word cloud there as well, and being able to critically think about what you need and what numeracy skills you will need to solve these problems. So looking at even climate change in the world that we live in, and what maybe looking at banking or mobile phone plans and what is best for you. So final dimension then of our theoretical framework was dispositions, which is very important, and I suppose it was very strong in this research, in that we found that our participants are it's really important that we have confidence in paying for goods and confidence in maybe splitting that bill, and understanding the mathematics and the numeracy skills that we need in everyday life in order to engage in society, and to engage in conversations, be it in work, maybe at home, or just out with your friends. So better understanding again of real issues, and ensuring that you're maybe confident in your own numeracy skills. So that was the theoretical framework that underpinned this research. So this leads us then to the research questions, which looked at what are adult learners' understandings and their conceptualizations of numeracy. So how do we view numeracy, and how do adult learners view numeracy? And then the second research question was, how can the theoretical model, the Common European Numeracy Framework that I just went through there, be used or adapted to represent adult learners' understandings of numeracy here in Ireland, and how can we benefit from that?
So thanks, Kathy. And I think Fiona, now another co-author, is going to come on and talk to us about the research design and methodology.
Thanks, Niamh. So first, the methodological approach, we looked at a qualitative study involving a scoping exercise. So we got a convenient sample. It was difficult enough to get participants for this, and we basically reached out to several different bodies that had adult learners in it and tried to get people from a variety of contexts. We use phone interviews as our instrument, as well as focus groups. So in one case, Kathy undertook a focus group with one of the men's sheds, and I think the remaining interviews were phone interviews, one-to-one basis. In terms of the sample size, we had 17 participants, 11 individuals, and then 6 people who participated in that focus group that I mentioned that Kathy undertook. And then in terms of demographics, we had a mix of male, so 13 males and just 4 females. And the ages, there was a large age range then between 22 and 72 years. So just to look at then some of the sample questions that we used, and bearing in mind that the questions we used were all trying to reflect the theoretical framework, so looking at our CENF model. And we looked at like where have you used numeracy in everyday life. So we asked participants to tell us about their family life, their work life, social and community, and then health and well-being. And do they think that they use numeracy in these different contexts? So we'll present some of the findings of those in a minute. We also looked at, when we kind of reflect back and think about the dispositions aspect of the CNF framework, this question looks at participants' emotions. So could you pick as many or few? They could pick as many or as few as they liked to represent what springs to mind when they think about numeracy. So at first we just kind of asked it as an open question and then used these as a prompt, and participants could obviously pick outside of this list as well. So that was interesting. And again, the dispositions and the effect of that on their numeracy and understanding and conceptualization. Another example question was that we asked about confidence when faced with numeracy tasks. So can you give an example of a scenario where you did feel confident when faced with a numeracy task, seeing if that was something that participants could relate to. And then just one final sample question, and there were more besides. We looked at participants' response to a numeracy task in a social setting. So do you tend to take something like this on or not? So we presented interviewees with the bill, and we got them to imagine a scenario where they're out with friends for a meal and they receive a bill, and how likely would they be to be the person to offer to, first of all, just calculate what everybody owes, and as Niamh mentioned earlier, to work out a percentage, and then, you know, what does everybody owe now? So when you're considering a tip, so we just got to see what was people's response to this. Would they be very much the person to put their head down, or would they take it on, and if so, why? So that's just some of the sample questions that we looked at. Then just to look at, so what did we actually find? So we had 4 key findings, and the first related to experience of mathematics at school. So all but one of the participants reported a negative experience of school maths. And here we're talking about both primary and secondary school mathematics. And then unfortunately, even the one student who did report a positive experience reported then that this became negative in secondary school. So you can see this quote by the participant, who, these are all pseudonyms. Well, in primary school, I loved maths. I found it really interesting. I was always really engaged in it. And then when I went into secondary school, my teachers weren't as good. I wasn't really getting to grips with it. So then I kind of started to dislike maths a lot. So it was kind of unanimous, this negative school experience amongst the participants that we had. Obviously, it varies depending on the sample. But why was this the case? I suppose then we looked at, there appeared to be 2 main causes of these negative experiences reported. One being time given to support students who didn't quite grasp things immediately. So those who had a bit of trouble. So here's a quote that kind of demonstrates that finding. I was isolated from 4th year because I couldn't understand algebra, and in the 4th year in day 1, we were told that we were not allowed to ask questions. And my punishment for asking a question was that I was kind of banished to the other side of the room. So very much, you know, a challenge for those who didn't immediately get an answer, in inverted commas, correct. And then there was a corporal punishment aspect as well to these negative experiences. So we had another quote to demonstrate that, which wasn't the only example in this kind of area. The stick was kind of going that time. I got a few lashes of the stick when I was younger anyway. I know it was the 70s, but still the stick was going. That was the way it was. You'd be more afraid of it. Probably I wasn't, probably I was a slow learner. So kind of nearly justifying the corporal punishment as if, you know, it was deserved. And that kind of alludes to the confidence then as well, which we're going to talk about next. So the next key finding related to the link between school experience, which you can see from those findings were almost unanimously negative, and confidence. So unsurprisingly, probably, or possibly unsurprisingly, that these negative school experiences had a lasting negative effect on participants' confidence. And there was a focus, and this is quite interesting, particularly when you consider the research side of things in the area. Most people reported a focus on getting things right, correct, in inverted commas, in the maths classroom, and doing this in an extremely prompt manner. So the focus was on being fast and being correct, again, in inverted commas. And I think a really important point here, there's a researcher in the UK, Professor Jo Bowler, who looks at maths education and best practice in maths education. And she talks about how it's not important to work quickly in mathematics. And the link with this and the beginnings of maths anxiety, which is likely to be the case with a lot of the participants in this study. So that's definitely an interesting finding that came out and was a strong theme throughout. The next one then that we found, the third of the 4 key findings, was the link between school experience and its impact on learners. So we found here many of the respondents reported feeling confident when faced with numeracy tasks now, despite their school experience, but that was because they saw numeracy as simple mathematics. So when we kind of looked at and got into the conceptualization and the keywords that were used, you can see here 2 of the participant examples. It's numbers, basically all numbers, and just to be able to do basic mathematics. So this was in response to a question, how would you describe numeracy? So they really did see it as just numbers and basic mathematics. And I think the point that we kind of made in the report here, and that's interesting also to see the word cloud and how you guys who are coming from a different perspective, maybe, you know, as being mathematics tutors or researchers, rather than just the participants, adult learners, which was the case in this study, that you saw, you see it in a more broader sense. So like the failure to differentiate the term numeracy and mathematics is a concern. And we kind of felt with this finding that maths and numbers featured in each of the responses, showing that many do see numeracy as being synonymous with maths. And the failure to differentiate this has been described by O'Donoghue in 2002 as a concern, because we're kind of equating and losing key attributes of numeracy when we do that. So things like sense making, application, decision making, which did appear in your word cloud when people talked about problem solving. All of those things are overlooked if we just equate numeracy with basic math. So we lose that multidimensional nature that Kathy spoke about and presented in the model and the theoretical framework. So that's something that, you know, was key finding in this report. Niamh's now going to look at the final key finding, which looks at the alignment between perceptions and the CENF model.
Thanks a million, Fiona. I feel less pressure delivering this talk than having to press the go forward button when you were talking. So thank you for that. So yeah, as Fiona said, I'm going to look at the alignment between learners' perceptions and the CENF. So the first segment of the CENF that I'm going to look at is the dispositions. And 2 of the key dispositions outlined in the CENF are self-confidence and self-belief. Self-belief fits under the beliefs section of this segment of the CENF. And when we asked, as Fiona went through, one of the questions required the learners to talk about the emotions that they associate with numeracy. So here we see that the adult learners associate the words nervousness, confusion, and anxiousness. So rather than the confidence and the self-belief, which the CENF says should be associated with numeracy, we see there's a sense of nervousness, confusion, and anxiousness among the participants in this study. And this is a cause for concern, because research has been conducted by Maria Ryan and colleagues here at the University of Limerick, which found that these emotions, so the nervousness, the confusion, the anxiety associated with numeracy, are actually symptomatic with maths anxiety. So this suggests that possessing them emotive responses to numeracy, or when they hear the term numeracy, actually can be an indicator that many of these adult learners are suffering from maths anxiety. And maths anxiety is a part of this dispositions, but it's obviously a negative attribute that we need, as tutors, need to try to help students to overcome, or our adult learners. Now, we do see, and I've already referenced it in terms of the self-belief, that beliefs is a key part of the disposition segment. But beliefs encapsulates more than just self-belief. It also includes people's beliefs about the power or the utility value of numeracy. So that is, how beneficial are numeracy skills to your life? And what we did find was a much more positive picture emerged in this regard. In the main, participants in this study valued numeracy, and they did appreciate the utility value of numeracy. And I think that is best highlighted by a comment from Callum, where he actually said it's almost nearly as essential to every day as it is to speaking a language. It's part of the language. Well, I can't see how a person will progress, even in their work or in their life, like, without numeracy. So what Callum is saying here, yes, he may not be confident in it. Yes, he may not say that he has great self-belief in himself, but he is saying, despite all of this, I realize how important numeracy is. And I think that message that Callum said, it's like a language. If we could get that out there, it might help to overcome so many of the stereotypes that are predominantly with mathematics, but also filter into numeracy because of that issue that Fiona spoke about, where we can't differentiate numeracy from mathematics as a society. I don't know how many times I've heard it on the radio or the TV, where it seems okay to say that you can't do mathematics or that you're not numerate. They don't use the term not numerate, it's more so, I can't do mathematics. It seems perfectly acceptable for people to proudly make statements in that regard. It's also perfectly acceptable, it seems, to compare, to kind of present mathematics on TV ads by government bodies. So the one I'm talking about is the An Post ad that talks about insurance quote being as difficult as higher level maths. So all of this negative talk around mathematics, which is seen as acceptable in society, it really lends itself to these negative connotations of mathematics first and foremost, but also of numeracy because of that blurred line between mathematics and numeracy at present. So I really think if we could all take Callum's message away, that numeracy is almost as essential as the language we speak on a daily basis. So that kind of looked at the dispositions component. And then we moved on to look at how the learners' perceptions aligned with the content component of the CENF. So we can see here in the CENF, there's a number of different contexts, from everyday life to further learning to health and care to recreation. And first of all, what we see in 11 of the 12 interviews and focus groups, it should be 10 of the 11 interviews and focus groups, people provided examples of finance context. Now, finance context obviously could also be the everyday life. So here was an example, handing back change to people, making sure it's correct. I suppose, calculating bills and stuff like that. And it's funny, when I was seeing the word cloud come up, finance and numbers were the two that struck me initially as being the most popular responses. Now, that did even itself out as we went on, but that was definitely the case in this scenario or in this study. And bearing in mind as well, we actually gave prompts to these respondents, or to the people we were interviewing, in terms of, we specifically said your everyday life, in terms of your well-being, in terms of your financial well-being, and your work life and so on. But still, a lot of it came back to finance. And what we found was slightly worrying was that, so 10 of the 11 interviews, they were able to say numeracy is used in financial matters. But in 5 of those 10 interviews, that was the only real life example that they could give of where they would use numeracy. So that meant that 6 out of the 11, because one person couldn't give any example, but 10 could give the example of finance, but 5 of them stopped at that point. So they were the only context that they saw numeracy used in. It was finance, or if they wanted to, we could frame that as everyday life. However, others did see it in health and care, as we see here from Martin, whose hobby was weightlifting. So he talks about how when he wants to make a weightlifting program for himself, he's building up with percentages. So he sees percentages as being a core component, and that helps him with his recreational activity, counting macros, percentage of carbs, protein, and all that he has to take throughout the day. And we also see here a work-related example, and this comes from the men's shed. What we found particularly interesting was the work-related examples given by the majority of the adult learners interviewed were in relation to trades. And that's an example here. So he was up in a trade. I use maths all the time. I was a floor layer. The hardest part was when we went from feet and inches to the metric system. So again, you can see, yes, there was some context touched on, but there was also some serious context not referred to. For example, citizenship, being maybe an informed citizen, particularly when we're in a data-drenched society. And I thought maybe with COVID being right now, COVID was mentioned once or twice, but in other contexts. In terms of recreation, whether, I know Martin was saying his hobby was weightlifting, but that more relates to health and care in terms of his diet and so on. So recreation wasn't really seeing. So the people that went out maybe watch a soccer match at the weekend, did they see any numeracy in that, in understanding what was happening and so on? So the next component of the framework that we looked at was the cognitive processes. So many were able to describe scenarios where they would use cognitive processes. But for example, Sarah said, when you want to measure, just say a thing of flour, you know, you pop your bowl on top of the weighing scales, and then it has its own measurement. So you have to minus the measurement of the end bowl compared to when it's a full bowl. Now, this type of task, if we look at the cognitive processes, it clearly would involve analysing a situation. Right? What must I do here if I want to get 200 grams of flour and I have to measure it in a bowl? It would require reasoning, and it would require critical thinking. So there was lots of examples like this. There was another one speaking about the amount of plaster, looking at the ratio to make plaster for a certain area. Again, we're speaking of a trade. And likewise, this was a question that we gave them. We said a special offer, you can get one pizza for €3.50, two pizzas for €7, something that we would see in shops every day of the week, talking about special offers. And we asked the students, well, what would you go with? Would you opt for the one pizza? Would you go with two pizzas? Again, when it comes under a signed special offer, we generally think more is better. All bar one student recognized that there was no value to be had in the two pizza deal, although it was being presented in that way. So despite these multiple examples, the example of Sarah baking, the example of the trade trying to create the plaster, and this example of the pizza deal, they show that cognitive processes are central to a lot of the numeric behavior of these adult learners. But despite this, in the interviews, the adult learners said that they did not use any higher order thinking skills when working with numeracy. So they all pretty much said that there was no association between these cognitive processes, managing situations, analyzing situations, processing information, and so on, and numeracy. Again, it kept coming back to, but no, numeracy is just basic mathematics. They could not believe themselves that they were capable of these higher order skills despite being competent in numeracy, but they also just did not associate any of them with numeric behavior. Finally, then we looked at the content. So numbers, again, coming back to our own workout, numbers and figures were seen to be synonymous with numeracy. And every single participant, all 11 participants across, or sorry, all 17, I should say, but across the focus groups and the interviews, recognized that numbers and figures were central to numeracy, with many saying numbers and figures equal to numeracy. What we also found was that people did recognize that you needed to have a good understanding of dimension and shape. So again, a lot of this, interestingly enough, came back to in the workplace, and a lot of it came back to trades. But it was interesting to see that 8 of the 12 did refer to that content strand. Now, finally, and this is the worrying part, only 2 participants referenced pattern relationships and change or data and chance. I was running out of space here, so I kind of bundled that into one bullet point. What I should really say is 2 participants recognized that numeracy involved understanding data and chance. No participant referenced pattern relationships and change as a component of numeracy. Another interesting finding that I thought was in relation to the 2 participants who recognized data and chance as a component of numeracy, both were older participants, let's say. So for example, Callum, one of the older participants in the men's shed, as far as I can remember, said, like the CSO, oh no, sorry, this wasn't, the men's shed was a different example. They were the 2, it was Callum and a person from the men's shed. But Callum said, like the CSO statistics, if I wanted to get something back and then I want to quote that, when I'd be involved, and I wasn't involved in a farming organization, I'd be representing them at different interviews. And when I was asked for, you have to give specifics and specific numbers. So again, he does mention statistics. I know he goes back to number in the end, but still it's the numbers are central to statistics as well. So he did recognize that statistics was a core component of numeracy. And again, he was a retired farmer, and the other comment in relation to statistics and data or chance came from the men's shed, as I said. So again, these were older participants in the sample, and the younger participants, despite growing up in an increasingly complex and information-drenched society, failed to see the need for a good understanding of data and probability in order to be considered numerate. So what was also interesting, the fact that no one in the study gave an example of pattern relationships and change being a core component of numeracy was interesting, but also of concern, because pattern relationships and change all relate to functions in mathematics, mathematical formulae, and so on. So for example, a good understanding of patterns and relationships would help significantly if students were required to convert, going back to the baking example, from Celsius to Fahrenheit, from miles to kilometers. That's all pattern relationships and change. So again, by not recognizing that is a serious concern for these adult learners. And finally then, and I hope I haven't gone too much over, what we also created as part of the CENF, so it was essentially seen as the second component of the CENF, was a structure whereby we could highlight different levels of numeracy, ranging from level X, where individuals might struggle with numeracy, to level Z, where individuals use numeracy in specialized work settings. Now, most participants in this study viewed numeracy as basic mathematics that required very few higher order skills, as we've mentioned already, suggesting many perceive themselves to be at level X. So that is your daily life situations, your basic needs, and where you would need numeracy. However, when we listened carefully back to the life stories that these people recounted to us, it would suggest that they were at a much higher level. So what we actually did was we went through the life stories and the examples that they gave us, and we categorized each of the stories. And we were able to say that 27% of participants in this study were actually at the highest level and gave examples of where they used numeracy in a specialized societal and work situations. Another 46% were at a level Y, which is using numeracy or being able to use numeracy in societal and regular work situations. Whereas only 27% of the sample were actually at level X and demonstrated that they only used basic numeracy skills. But despite this, none of them saw numeracy as anything more than basic skills. I'll give you just one example and I'll finish off on this. Tracy, one of the participants, was asked to describe a scenario where she used numeracy, and she responded, and this is taken word for word, "Well, I can't really think of anything offhand." And she stopped there. Now, she did then go on and tell us about one of the proudest moments, and one of the moments when she felt confident, but she stressed, but not to do with numeracy, just confidence in general. And what she talked about here was how she had organized a charity event to raise money for a local member of the community. She discussed how she organized the event, was responsible for ticket sales, and in the end generated over €5,000 for this charitable cause. She then went on to say her proudest moment, her proudest achievement, was standing up and talking at this event. However, she did not see any numeracy involved. Now, from listening to Tracy's story, such an undertaking will clearly involve the use of a multitude of different components of the CENF. The financial context would have been used, the citizenship context would have been used. I'm assuming a calculator of some sort was used when determining prices, calculating payments, and calculating how much revenue was taken in, using quantity and number, mathematizing again to price tickets and so on for the event would have been used. But despite all of this, Tracy stated that she rarely used, nor was she confident in using numeracy skills beyond a very basic level. So they are the key findings. I will now hand over to Fiona, who I think is going to have just a quick discussion with yourselves, and then we'll look at Fiona will look at the implications. So Fiona, I'll hand back to you.
Thanks, Niamh. Yeah, just before we present, and we are just coming to the close now of the talk, I'm just going to briefly talk about implications and some concluding thoughts. But before we present the implications that we came up with based on those 4 key findings, so kind of jogging back through them, we looked at experience in school, kind of the link between school experience and confidence, and then looking at conceptualization of mathematics or of numeracy, so that link or kind of tendency to link numeracy as being synonymous with basic maths. And finally then the detail that Niamh presented on alignment of learners' perceptions and the CNF model. Would anybody feel comfortable or like to contribute what they feel implications might be based on these findings? So what action points might you think need to be taken, like from an educator's point of view, policymakers, employers, So depending on, there's many different stakeholders. Based on those findings, what do you think, we need to do next, basically? So feel free to put it into the chat if you're more comfortable, or if you have any thoughts on it. We're just interested, even to inform ourselves more, to see what you might come up with, or if anybody's comfortable to turn on their mic, please do that. So I might just leave that open for a minute and see if anybody has any thoughts on that before we just close off.
And tell you what we think the implications are.
Yes, exactly.
Hello, my name is Tony Sweeney.
Hi, Tony. How are you?
And I was a teacher in Greater. I'm retired now. But in my experience, many people who came in for mathematics, they wanted, there's a lot of these that were men now. They wanted for work related, and they were anxious to get it, maybe in some case get a job, but because of their lack of mathematics, they didn't get employed. So in lots of cases, we tried to give them information on, it might be something, a job, for instance, like tiling. So we tried to give them information on how tiling was done and incorporate the maths with that.
Yeah.
Sometimes it might be only just calculating the price of the work and the price of the tiles and measuring up how many tiles are needed. It's as simple as that. So I think maybe that with IT and all that, that you could say for tutors that mightn't have knowledge of, say, trades or skills, that they could supplement their teaching by using these in the classroom and putting the maths training onto that.
Yeah, brilliant. Thanks, Tony, because it's really useful to hear from like experienced tutors, and also to see if we've aligned with the kind of ideas that you would have as practitioners. So that we have touched on something like that, and thanks for your contribution. Did anybody else want to come in? If not, I might just go back to the PowerPoint, Niamh, just to allow time for a bit of discussion at the end. And thanks again, Tony, for that. I'm glad we've hit on one point anyway that hopefully, comes from those of you with experience as well. So we kind of felt with 6 key implications that SOLAS, in collaboration with the FET sector and others, should agree a working definition of numeracy. So Niamh kind of said, as a full disclosure at the start, this report hasn't resulted in a definition for numeracy, but it's very much aimed at informing it from the perspective of adult learners today. As well as that, we wanted to look at all involved in the education system in Ireland and a need for them to be aware that numeracy and mathematics are not the same. And I think that's definitely a key message to get across for all of us, that we kind of nearly habitual could use the terms interchangeable. But it's good to have these models and see the clear distinctions and the multifaceted nature of numeracy. As well as that, every effort needs to be made to build effective adult numeracy teaching and learning practices in Ireland and develop resources to help in this regard. And I think this is where Tony's point really comes in, that like if we could have people who could develop these supplementary teaching resources that link with, jobs that adult learners might be interested in doing, you're very much building on that confidence and context that the adult learners need, to move forward in numeracy and to improve on it. We also felt that there needs to be a change in the narrative, and Niamh spoke about this, around numeracy in Ireland, and it needs to be presented in a more positive light. Like, you do follow what you hear, and even as Niamh gave the example of ads on the telly, it just becomes kind of a foregone conclusion that anything to do with numeracy or maths, and as they can be confused, if that's difficult and we can't do it, that's just the narrative that continues. So that needs to be changed. Further research is needed to determine if the education system, particularly at upper primary and lower secondary, is actually catering for the needs of those who struggle with basic maths concepts. We saw that history tells us if you're not correct and fast, you're overlooked. And this is obviously, you know, not a right teaching practice at all, and something that maybe needs to be removed from the culture of our Irish secondary school and primary school classrooms. And finally, then, adult learner and numeracy providers need to recognise and respond to adults' previous experience of learning mathematics at school, and particular possibly the gaps in their knowledge after completing it. So everybody comes with a context, and this matters when we're teaching them. Likewise, what was mentioned here, that it's important, you know, to also understand and anticipate adult learners' interest now. So just to close up on the talk, and we're very grateful for your attention and participation, and hopefully look forward to some comments. We've established that adult learners do have a limited understanding of the concept of numeracy, and that there's clear disparity between the CNF model and all of its intricacies and adult learners' beliefs regarding what contributes to their numeric behaviour. So a lot of the time underplaying, you know, the level of numeracy that they have in their everyday life. But there are things that we can do, you know, insights to improve things. So policymakers could look to refine the working definition of numeracy, which is one of the key outputs here, hopefully. We could look to publicise the broader definition of numeracy and develop teaching and learning aids to support this. So make that public, that broader definition, and that we're not using that synonymous with basic maths. As well as that, to highlight the wide variety of numeracy skills needed in particular jobs, and that employers maybe can do this, and this can feed into what numeracy tutors engage with. And finally, then, just to look to educators to work with adult learners to build confidence and self-efficacy, and the importance of this. And I suppose being mindful of how possible this low confidence could be coming from school maths experiences. So we just to thank you again for your attention and contribution to our talk today and our presentation of this report. And we're really interested to hear any thoughts or reactions that you have, or questions. So thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Fiona.
I'd just like to say again, thanks to Fiona, Niamh, Kathy, and I think Mark's there, and Merlin. I have to say, as you know, as we've heard today, maths is not always everybody's favorite subject, but I have to say the enthusiasm and particularly the excitement I know Niamh had when she was, you know, looking at the findings from this was actually infectious. And I think for us, it did kind of stimulate, huge conversations about the issues that, you know, have been raised by the report. But I also think the possibilities, and I think, you know, where you finished, Fiona, in terms of your comments about the confidence and the efficacy. And I think that was something that really struck us, that, you know, in terms of, you know, the individuals that you spoke with through the research, they were using maths and numeracy every day in their lives. They just didn't realize it, and they didn't necessarily realize the extent to which they were using it. So I think that was a really great insight. And I think even as Tony was saying, that, you know, individuals are using numeracy every day, and sometimes they don't know about it, and it's how do we build on what we call that wealth model, that people are using it. How do we build on it, and don't call it maths or numeracy? You know, I think we have to kind of get away from those terms. But as I said, I think it's given us lots of food for thought in terms of the possibilities. And I know it's something that we're very keen in NALA to be moving that conceptualization and that framework on, and seeing how we build it in to adult education practices, as you said, with you know, aids, definitions, and kind of supporting people on their journey. So I'll stop talking now. I don't know if anybody has any last comment or question they might like to put in.
Colleen, there's just a couple of comments in the chat, so I'll read them out. So
Great.
Paul said, really useful report and discussion. Great to think about this and come up with better ways of framing how we talk about numeracy and number confidence. And then Gemma said, really interesting, especially the idea that adult learners may have a much higher level of numeracy than they realize themselves, which I think is what you're saying there.
Great. So listen, I'm conscious we're coming up to the bewitching hour of 2:00. So again, just to reiterate our thanks to Niamh, Fiona, Kathy, Merlin, Mark, and as I said, thank you to yourselves who attended, and hopefully please, for those of you who are involved in this space, we didn't have a huge audience today, but it's not about quantity, it's about quality. So please do spread the word, and it will be work that we will continuing to develop, and I look forward to having those conversations with the research group about where we go from here with numeracy, maths, and all that is possible. So thank you all.
And thanks, Colleen. And I'd just like to say as well, just to thank everyone that we've worked with in NALA for the opportunity, and especially yourself, Colleen, Claire, Helen, and Fergus, who've been a great support for this work, and it just wouldn't have been possible without you. So thanks very much for all the support.
You're very welcome.
Yeah.
Okay, folks, listen, I think we're going to wrap it up there, and as I said, have a great day and enjoy the rest of Maths Week.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you.
Okay, everybody,
Bye.
talk to you soon.
Bye.
Bye-bye.